15 April 1942. A narrow, windowless room in the Petroleum Warfare Department, Westminster, London, the air thick with the smell of tobacco, engine oil, and the damp wool of overcoats hung on pegs. Outside, a spring drizzle stitched the pavement. Inside, a cluster of men in shirt sleeves crowded around a battered table, their faces lit by a single swinging lamp. They were not soldiers with swaggering epaulets but engineers and oilmen, men who read pressures and tolerances the way others read maps. Among them stood Arthur Clifford Hartley, chief engineer for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He had the look of a man used to solving practical impossibilities, ink-smudged fingers, a notebook bulging with diagrams, and an intensity that made the others lean closer. Hartley tapped a stub of pencil against a scrap of paper and, without preamble, drew a line. It was a simple line, except he did not mean it to represent a road or a telephone wire. He meant it to represent fuel, petrol, diesel, aviation spirit running in a continuous ribbon from Britain to the beaches of France. The idea, heard out of context, would have sounded like lunacy, a pipeline laid under the tumultuous, mined, and patrolled waters of the English Channel. But these were men who had seen the war's numbers. Tens of thousands of jerrycans, hundreds of tankers, convoys swallowed by weather, by U-boats, by enemy aircraft. They knew that the Allied advance would live or die by its bloodline of fuel. "Look here," Hartley said, voice low but sharp, "we do this the way we lay submarine telegraph cable. A continuous length. Hardened. Armored. Laid by a cable ship. High pressure. If it holds, we can pump petrol straight to the continent without relying on tankers and vulnerable shore depots." He pointed at the tiny dots marking pumping stations on the map, at the stretch of seabed between Dover and the Isle of Wight, and at the thinned-out infrastructure of liberated France. The room smelled of skepticism. One of the men, a civilian engineer named Bernard Ellis, a burly figure who had spent years working with pipes in Mesopotamia and India, grunted. He had the practical squint of a man who'd welded steel in summer heat and knew what materials were scarce back home. "Leads in short supply," he said, thinking of wartime economies and rationing. "An armor who's going to make a cable that won't kink, catch, or be sliced by a mine?" That was the point. Hartley knew about the 3-inch pipeline used in Persia, running at pressures that would have made a sailor wince. He knew about extruded lead, asphalt layers, paper impregnated with resin materials that could be combined so the pipe carried petrol, yet flexed like a living thing when wrapped in steel tape and hemp. He knew that at high pressure, different fuels would move without mixing. He had a practical memory of the rolling deserts and the problems of keeping liquids clean and moving in war. As he spoke, the lamp threw their faces into sharp relief. The petroleum chemist from the ministry, a captain from the Royal Navy seconded to logistics, a naval architect with salt still in his hair. Each man began to add a piece. The Navy could provide cable, layer ships. Siemens Brothers could adapt undersea telegraph cable techniques to make an oil-carrying core. The National Physical Laboratory could test materials. J&E Hall might fabricate segments when lead ran short. It was a mosaic assembled in a cramped room by men who knew how to make the impossible routine. Outside, the Channel's light had gone oily, the sky and sea merged into the color of old pewter. The men did not notice, their world had shrunk to charts and calculations, to the smell of coffee gone cold in chipped enamel cups. Hartley sketched the idea of 2 systems, one based on a lead inner pipe with layers of armoring to be called Hayes, after Hartley, Anglo, Iranian, and Siemens, and another, simpler mild steel pipe that could be joined in welded segments, a stopgap if lead supplies failed. The second, later christened Hamel, would be the product of Bernard Ellis and H.A. Hammock. Hartley's mind already saw 2 colors of cable laid like braided arteries across the Channel. There was more than metal and maths at stake. Hartley knew that secrecy was as crucial as engineering. If the Germans suspected that the Allies had planned a way to run fuel uninterrupted to the continent, they would concentrate mines, surface raiders, and airstrikes on the route. He imagined camouflaged pumping houses along the coast, villas and bathing pavilions that hid Byron Jackson pumps and diesel engines, concealed storage tanks and a web of pipes feeding into the sea. He imagined electricians and boilermakers working at night, lorries taking equipment to anonymous corners, maps quietly edited so that no hint of the project remained. The men around the table were already making plans in whispers. Sandown and Dungeness, they muttered, names that would later be written in secret logs. Hartley's pitch was not received with unbounded enthusiasm. Someone muttered that laying a pipeline under the channel was like threading a lead pencil through a gale. Another worried about temperature, about pressure loss over distance, about the corrosive effect of seawater. Hartley listened. He was not immune to the technical objections. He had prepared figures and trials. He knew that the secret lay in existing knowledge: repurposed telegraph cable design, proven materials, expertise in high-pressure pumping. He had seen how a 3-inch pipeline in Iran had worked under 1,500 pounds per square inches, delivering prodigious quantities of oil across rough terrain. If that could be adapted to an undersea environment, he argued, it would eliminate the daily gamble of tankers and jetties. "Get me a trial," he said finally, and the room exhaled. Trials would be cheap to say and expensive to do. They meant men, ships, material, and nights when the whole country was doing other things. But Hartley had more than faith. He had an advocate in Sir William Fraser, chairman of Anglo-Iranian, who happened to advise the War Office on petroleum and agreed to fund early trials. With a senior executive's backing, the whisper began to take the shape of action. Within weeks, plans for trials moved like a ripple through discrete corridors of power. A yard in the Firth of Clyde would be chosen for sea trials of a Heiss prototype. The Solent would host early Hamel experiments. An Admiralty hopper barge, later to be named HMS Persephone, would be adapted to carry a floating drum called a conundrum, a giant spool designed to ease the laying of hundreds of miles of pipe. The conundrum itself would become one of those vivid, almost absurd images that war brings into being: a ship carrying a spool the size of a small island, turning on the waves as if the sea were a giant reel. Hartley did not let hubris take root. He wrote specs, burned through sleepless nights over test results, and traveled between shipyards explaining why this mattered. In the streets of Liverpool and the iron halls of Siemens, skilled hands took to new tasks: extruding a lead inner core, wrapping it in asphalt and textile, winding steel tape, fitting a canvas cover and camouflaging it for the seabed. Where lead was short, Ellis and his team devised the mild steel Hamel, welded in 30-foot segments and tested under pressure until each seam whispered of reliability. Men who had spent their lives working on boilers and telephones now learned the language of petrol at 1,500 pounds per square inches. The first trials were awkward and small. Pipes chafed and kinked, weld residues caused sparks of trouble, and the sea threw its temper at the testers. Night after night the conundrum groaned as it paid out lengths of pipe. Quality men sat hunched over welding rigs, swabs of fluorescing dye added to test fuel to spot leaks visible from aircraft above. Some nights a trial would be abandoned, other nights the pipe would lie in the water like a promise. Each success a mile or two laid and still holding was celebrated with the guarded joy that only men who knew the cost of failure could muster. As word of progress filtered back down to the small room in Westminster, the mood changed. What had been a pipe dream muttered in coffee rooms became an operation with machinery, with names, with vessels painted for secrecy and pumping stations disguised as seaside cottages. Still, even as plans scaled up, Hartley remained that odd mix of dreamer and methodical engineer, impatient for results, relentless in detail. He could see beyond the immediate tasks to a broader design: multiple lines feeding from camouflaged stations, each line serviced by powerful diesel and centrifugal pumps, Byron Jackson machines that could pull hundreds of thousands of gallons a day at high pressure. And yet, for all the machinery and technical bravado, the human element kept returning to the front of Hartley's mind: the drivers who would bring pipe sections to the ports under blackout, the dock workers who would work through nights without fanfare, the servicemen in small boats who would stand watch over the newly laid lines. He wrote memorial-like records, not because he wanted recognition but because he knew the truth: remarkable engineering does not happen in labs alone. It is made in muddy quays and factory floors, in boring meetings and long trench-like shifts, in the quiet courage of men who take orders and make them reality. That first day in April had ended with the lamp swinging and the men filing out into the drizzle, a little less sure than when they entered but with a new, brittle hope. They had agreed on trials. They had agreed to 3 words: pipelines under the ocean. PLUTO, a codename that sounded whimsical and therefore perfectly suitable for the kind of quiet deception this war required. Hartley walked back into the night, his notebook under arm, and could not know yet that decades later antiquarians would call PLUTO both audacious and essential. He only knew that the numbers had added up enough to risk trying. If the sea would cooperate, if the conundrum would roll true, then somewhere in the not-too-distant future British petrol would no longer be a commodity dumped ashore under fire. It would flow, quietly and steadily, as a new and secret artery powering liberation. June 1942. Somewhere off the Isle of Wight, the wind came in hard from the southwest, the kind that turned waves into steel ridges and made the rigging sing. The cable ship HMS Holdfast rolled with a slow, ponderous rhythm, her decks slick with rain and oil. On her aft deck, men in thick duffel coats and rubber boots wrestled with something no ship had ever carried before, a massive, drum-shaped reel as tall as a house. It groaned like a living thing as it turned, paying out a thick, tar-black cable into the sea. That cable was the world's first haze pipe, Hartley's creation in metal and grit, built in the Siemens factory at Woolwich. Inside it ran a soft lead course surrounded by layers of paper, bitumen, and steel tape, every inch designed to carry high-pressure petrol through salt water without bursting or leaking. To a casual observer, it looked like nothing more than a telephone cable, but this one was meant to feed an army. Lieutenant Commander Edgar Worthington, the Navy liaison for the test, kept one hand on a rail as he watched the conundrum spin. He had been skeptical when the Petroleum Warfare Department first approached him. A pipeline under the channel sounded like something from Punch magazine. But now, seeing the slow rhythm of machinery, the careful coordination between ship, spool, and sea, he began to believe that madness and genius were sometimes cousins. Hartley himself was below deck, bent over gauges and pumps. Beside him stood Bernard Ellis, sweat beading at his temples despite the cold. The engineers had spent sleepless weeks fixing leaks and recalibrating welds. The first prototypes had failed spectacularly. Pressure tests had sent jets of petrol shooting 30 feet into the air, hissing through cracks like snakes. But this new version, reinforced and precisely extruded, was holding steady. "Pressure at 1,200 pounds, called a petty officer from the console. "Flow steady." Ellis exhaled, half in disbelief. "If it stays that way," he muttered, "we'll have petrol from Portsmouth to Cherbourg before Christmas." Hartley smiled faintly, not daring to celebrate yet. He knew the sea had a way of humbling men who thought in straight lines. The channel floor was no gentle plain, it was a landscape of ridges, trenches, and mines. Even with perfect materials, the laying operation would have to thread through those obstacles while keeping the pressure constant and the pipe unbroken. They'd tested smaller lengths before, a mile or two, but this was the first real attempt at scale. From the conundrum's spinning drum, the pipeline stretched out behind the ship like a black serpent, sinking in arcs through green-gray water. Every 100 yards, the engineers checked tension and pressure. Every half hour, a diver dropped down to confirm the line hadn't snagged or twisted. Then, at 11:47 hours, a shout came from the deck. "Pressure drop." Ellis sprinted up the ladder, boots clanging on steel. The gauge needle was falling. 1,200, 1,100, 950. He grabbed a wrench, cursed, and shouted for the pumps to hold. Hartley appeared behind him, eyes narrow, already doing the mental math: flow resistance, temperature variance, mechanical stress from the drum rotation. For a few dreadful minutes the scene dissolved into chaos: men shouting across the wind, runners slipping on the wet deck, a crewman hauling the manual brake on the conundrum. The reel slowed, then stopped. The storm pressed in, hissing across the sea. Hartley knelt beside the console, fingertips tracing the graph. The drop wasn't catastrophic, not a rupture, but a leak. 10-1, it's a joint, he said, between the second and third splice. Worthington looked at him grimly. "You think we can fix it underwater?" "No," Hartley said, rising. "We'll find it when we bring her in. And then we'll start again." That was the rhythm of the summer. Build, test, fail, rebuild. They worked in the Solent, in the Clyde, off Dumfries and Southampton, sometimes under the name of cable testing, sometimes underwater conduit trials. The secrecy was so tight that half the dockworkers didn't know what they were helping to create. Each trial taught them something. Lead cores needed a tougher sheath to resist bending. The steel taping had to be wound in opposite directions to avoid torsion. The conundrum reels, some of them 50 feet across, required bearings strong enough to handle hundreds of tons of coiled pipe. Every small success came with another setback, another discovery written in grease pencil and sweat. By September, they had a pipeline that held pressure for 24 hours straight. Then 48. Then a week. When the Navy tested it by running petrol from shore to ship and back again, the engineers cheered not loudly, but with the weary satisfaction of men who had fought physics to a draw. The project's code name, PLUTO, was now used openly in secure briefings. The name amused the men: a god of the underworld, guardian of hidden things, perfect for a pipeline that would run unseen beneath the sea. But the war outside their laboratories and test sites was moving faster. By late 1943, the Allies were preparing for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. The question was no longer if PLUTO would work, but when it could be ready. That December, Churchill himself was briefed. The Prime Minister listened in silence as Hartley and Sir William Fraser laid out their findings. 2 systems, Hayes and Hamel, could be produced in quantity. Each line could deliver up to 1 million gallons of fuel per day once operational. Churchill leaned back in his chair, cigar smoke curling through the air. 1 million gallons under the sea, he murmured. Gentlemen, if you can make that work, the Hun won't know what hit him. The order came the next day. Accelerate full production. Factories in Woolwich, Gravesend, and Tilbury began working around the clock. Steel mills rolled miles of pipe. Women in coveralls wound tape around coiling drums. Tanker trucks ferried test petrol for calibration. Across the south of England, strange, camouflaged buildings began to appear, fake bungalows, seaside cafes, and ice cream stands that were in fact pumping stations feeding into the waiting lines. The public had no idea. To them, these were wartime oddities, restricted areas along the coast, fenced-off depots, workers who never talked about what they did. But to Hartley's team, every brick and bolt mattered. In March 1944, the first full-scale test came. HMS Latimer laid a Hayes line between the Isle of Wight and the mainland, 30 miles of continuous pipe. When the pumps engaged, the engineers held their breath. The flow began slowly, then steadied. For 12 hours the pressure held. At dawn, Worthington sent a single-word telegram to London headquarters. Success. For the first time, PLUTO wasn't a dream. It was a weapon. June 5, 1944. Portsmouth Harbor. The sea was alive with movement tugs, landing craft, troop transports, tankers, and cable ships, all heaving under the gray pre-dawn sky. A low mist rolled across the channel, hiding the vastness of the armada assembling for Operation Overlord. On the quayside, between fuel drums and camouflage netting, Arthur Hartley stood watching. He could see the outlines of the cable-laying vessels HMS Latimer and HMS Sancroft anchored in the harbor, each carrying a massive conundrum reel wound tight with hundreds of miles of pipeline. Engineers and sailors moved about their decks in quiet coordination, checking valves and clamps one last time. Nearby, a convoy of tankers waited, engines humming, ready to deliver the first precious cargo. Fuel for the invasion fleet and, soon, for the men who would storm the beaches of Normandy. Pressure test complete, called an officer from Latimer's deck. Holding steady at 1400. Hartley nodded but said nothing. He had spent 2 years chasing this moment, 2 years of skepticism, failures, and sleepless nights filled with calculations scrawled in the margins of blueprints. Now his pipe dream was about to be uncoiled beneath one of the most heavily guarded waterways on Earth. But for now, PLUTO would have to wait. The storm that had delayed the D-Day landings had also made pipeline laying impossible. The channel was too rough, the currents too unpredictable. The order was clear: hold the operation until after the beaches were secured. When the invasion began the next morning, June 6, 1944, Hartley and his engineers listened to the news from a radio in the pumping station at Sandown, the air thick with diesel fumes and the hum of generators. Code names drifted through static. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Allied troops were ashore. The first beachheads were holding. But behind the triumph was a growing logistical nightmare. Each tank, each jeep, each aircraft on French soil needed fuel. At first, the Allies relied on tombola, makeshift supply dumps created from jerrycans ferried across the beaches. Every gallon had to be unloaded by hand, carried through the surf, and driven inland under enemy fire. It worked, but barely. By mid-June, fuel shortages were threatening to stall the advance. That was when PLUTO came to life. The first operational lines, known as Bambi, ran from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg. The Navy had cleared the route of mines, and the cable layers began the delicate process of unspooling the Hayes pipe beneath the waves. The operation took place mostly at night, the ship's lights hooded, engines running low to avoid detection. Men in rubber suits guided the pipe as it slid into the water, their faces pale in the dim glow of deck lamps. By July 12, 1944, the first fuel reached the continent. The telegram to London was brief. Pipeline delivering. Flow continuous. Cheers erupted in the pumping station at Sandown. For the first time in history, Petrol was flowing under the sea straight from Britain's refineries to the heart of the invasion. But the success was fragile. Within weeks, the Bambi lines began to falter. The Cherbourg facilities had been too heavily damaged during the fighting, and the pipes suffered from mechanical stress in deeper waters. Pressure drops became frequent, and repairs under wartime conditions were nearly impossible. Hartley refused to let the idea die. He and Bernard Ellis proposed a new route, longer, but safer from Dungeness on the Kent coast to the port of Boulogne. The seabed there was smoother, the distance shorter, and Boulogne's harbor, though damaged, could be repaired faster than Cherbourg's. The new system, codenamed Dumbo, would use both Hayes and Hamel lines in parallel. Churchill approved the plan immediately. The next few months were a frenzy of activity. British factories ran day and night, producing pipe sections, armored joints, and floating drums. The Navy mobilized more ships for the laying Operation Sancroft, Holdfast, and Latimer among them. Each voyage had to be planned with military precision. Tides, weather, and enemy reconnaissance were constant threats. On August 27, 1944, Sancroft began paying out the first Dumbo line. The channel lay calm under a bright sky, the sea glittering like burnished steel. From the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Worthington gave quiet orders as the conundrum spun. Slowly, carefully, the great reel turned mile after mile of pipe slipping into the depths. Below decks, engineers monitored the pressure gauges. Every few minutes, a runner would call out a number, 1100, 1120, holding. The hum of the pumps became a steady heartbeat. When the line reached Boulogne, the connection was made to the shore terminal, a cluster of camouflage tanks and pumps disguised as a ruined farm. The first test flow began at dawn. The pressure held. By noon, fuel was flowing at full capacity, hundreds of thousands of gallons a day. In London, the War Office received the signal. PLUTO. Operational. Boulogne receiving. It was one of the quietest, least celebrated triumphs of the war, but to those who understood logistics, it was a miracle. The Allies now had a continuous, protected supply line that could keep their tanks, trucks, and aircraft moving across France without risking convoys or depots. As the armies pushed toward Paris and beyond, the PLUTO lines kept humming beneath the waves, unseen and unheralded. Every gallon that flowed under the channel meant fewer tankers sunk, fewer men lost at sea, and faster progress toward Berlin. And yet, the men who built it, Hartley, Ellis, Worthington, and the thousands of engineers and laborers who worked in silence, could tell no one. Their victory remained classified, hidden beneath a bland code name and a web of secrecy. That autumn, as Allied forces broke through into Belgium, the pumping stations along the English coast still ran day and night. Inside their walls, the smell of hot oil and ozone filled the air. Operators in overalls leaned over gauges, adjusting valves by hand, listening to the deep, rhythmic thrum of machinery that never stopped. Sometimes, when the night shift was quiet, Hartley would walk along the coast near Dungeness. The stars would hang low over the black water, and the only sound was the low hum of the pumps behind him. Out there in the darkness, two great arteries pulsed invisibly through the sea, feeding an army he would never see, powering the liberation of a continent. He would smile to himself, remembering that room in Westminster 2 years before, the skeptical faces, the laughter when he said it could be done. Now it was done. November 1944, northern France. Mud, sleet, and the grinding roar of engines, that was what liberation smelled like now. Allied convoys stretched for miles, headlights dimmed to slits, their tires cutting deep into frozen roads. From the Normandy hedgerows to the outskirts of Liège, columns of Sherman tanks and Bedford lorries rumbled eastward, their fuel gauges steady thanks to something no soldier ever saw: a stream of petrol flowing invisibly beneath the English Channel. Operation PLUTO was fully alive. Every day, more than 1 million gallons of fuel crossed the seabed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. From the pumping stations hidden in the seaside villas of Sandown and Dungeness, fuel surged through the Hayes and Hamel lines to Boulogne and Cherbourg, then onward through a network of smaller pipelines feeding forward depots near Brussels and Antwerp. And the soldiers who filled their tanks or topped off their jerrycans never knew where it came from. Inside one of those English pumping stations, outwardly a nondescript cottage with lace curtains and a garden fence, the heart of the system beat relentlessly. The floor thrummed under the weight of Byron Jackfugal pumps, each one the size of a small car. Operators moved among them in heavy ear protector coveralls streaked with oil. The noise was constant, a metallic thunder, punctuated by the hiss and the rhythmic clatter of engines. Hartley visited often, though he no longer needed to. He gave cigarettes to the night crew, checked the pressure logs, asked after the latest readings from Bologna. Past they knew who he was, the quiet behind this entire network. But Hartley himself never looked proud. He looked watchful, almost. He understood that a single crack spike could undo years of work. Across the channel, the receiving stations at Boulogne were little more than sheds built out of scrap timber and salvaged German concrete. But inside, the pipes sang. Petrol surged into holding tanks, ready to be distributed through hastily welded secondary lines. The Allied advance had become a moving organism, its veins stretching forward, its lifeblood steady. And the numbers told the story. By December 1944, over 180 million gallons had been delivered through PLUTO. By war's end, that figure would reach nearly 300 million. The system would run for 11 months straight without catastrophic failure. Yet to the public and even to many in uniform it was invisible. The press knew nothing. Official communiques spoke vaguely of improvements in supply infrastructure. When Allied correspondents asked how fuel was being moved so efficiently across a destroyed continent, officers smiled and changed the subject. Even after victory, Churchill himself would keep Pluto's full-scale classified for months, fearing the knowledge might one day inspire imitation. Meanwhile, on the ground, PLUTO was doing more than anyone had dared hope. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December, the pipelines became the difference between momentum and collapse. As German forces counterattacked through the Ardennes, Allied fuel reserves dwindled. Tankers were trapped by weather and enemy fire, and roads became impassable with ice. The PLUTO lines, buried deep and protected from bombing, continued to flow. One British quartermaster later wrote, "We lived on that line." Without it, Patton would have stopped dead in Belgium. But the system's endurance came at a price. Maintenance crews worked in near silence under blackout conditions, repairing leaks and clogs with almost no margin for error. Some nights they crawled through half-flooded trenches along the Kent coast, feeling for vibrations in the pipes. Others risked air raids while refitting valves by flashlight. Their work left no medals, no headlines, but without it, the tanks rolling toward the Rhine would have ground to a halt. In February 1945, as the Allies crossed into Germany, Hartley received a telegram from the Petroleum Warfare Department. All lines holding. Pressure stable. Continental advance fully supplied. He read it in his small London office, the same one where he'd first drawn that line on a scrap of paper 3 years before. The war was turning toward its end. Soon, the pipes would run not toward battle, but toward peace. And yet, Hartley couldn't shake the feeling that the real miracle wasn't the engineering, it was the collaboration. Tens of thousands of people had touched this project. Factory workers, welders, cable spinners, ship crews, and mathematicians. Even schoolchildren who collected scrap metal for the lead sheathing had unknowingly contributed. It was a national act of faith disguised as plumbing. When victory finally came in May 1945, PLUTO was still pumping. The pipes continued running until August, when the flow was finally shut off and the stations decommissioned. Some of the conundrums were left rusting in coastal yards, others were scrapped for their steel. The pipelines themselves were salvaged in segments, cut, hauled, and sold off, their wartime secret buried beneath the tide. Arthur Hartley returned to civilian life quietly. No medals, no parades, just a letter of thanks from the Admiralty and the satisfaction of knowing that his wild idea had worked. Bernard Ellis went back to the oil business. Worthington took command of a research vessel. The men who had built PLUTO scattered back into ordinary life, their story classified, their names largely forgotten. Years later, tourists walking the beaches of Sandown and Dungeness would sometimes find strange coils of rusted metal half buried in the shingle. Children would climb on them, not knowing they were once arteries of war, fragments of a secret network that had fueled the liberation of Europe. In 1946, a small plaque was quietly placed near Sandown, barely noticeable among the dunes. It bore a simple inscription. From these shores, fuel flowed to freedom. Operation PLUTO, 1944, 1945. And somewhere, in an old desk drawer, Arthur Hartley's original scrap of paper still survived, the one with that single pencil line, drawn by a man everyone thought was dreaming. It turned out, he was. And that dream powered the road to victory.